How's it going? Necrotic Nick here with Thralls of Metal, and I'm about to do another underrated albums segment. This will be underrated death metal albums from the late 90s. Now this one was a little bit trickier because death metal in the late 90s was kind of struggling. A lot of groove metal took over, and then new metal took over, and death metal was pretty much 100% out of the limelight. That once budding scene had kind of crept really underground. So there weren't a lot of really big releases, in my opinion. Like, there were definitely some, but a lot of even the major bands had more underground releases. And that's why I think some of these are more underrated or just kind of get pushed aside even by more hardline fans. So I thought I'd bring up some. So starting off, we have Descendant Degeneration. Now this one might be a bit of a reach because this was a band from my hometown. This was an unsigned independent release, but it is really hard to find and super underground and really good. Very straight ahead, old school death metal, very much in the vein of Cannibal Corpse, even some suffocation influence. The song Dereel and In Isolation, which tracks as one track on here, is about a 10-minute epic sounding death metal track. Like, this is just raw, gnarly sounding shit. So if you're a fan of like good old school death metal, this came out in 1995. It has that early 90s sound 100%. If you can find this, I think it's on YouTube. Like, you can at least jam it. As far as physical copies, I don't know how many of these are still around. Maybe in my hometown you can find it. I don't know. But definitely check it out. Alright, more well-known one, Broken Hope, Loathing. This was on my list of albums that got me into death metal, and I really still dig the fuck out of this album. Super underrated band. Like, some of their earlier stuff was almost proto-brutal death. I was already into Cannibal Corpse at the time, so the ultra-low, almost gurgly vocals, I was pretty much already hazed into that, so I really got into this right away. But what these guys brought was, different than Cannibal Corpse. They had more groove to them that kind of reminded me of Obituary, which I thought about putting them on this list, but they really weren't that underrated, I think. They might have an underrated release or two, but they're still super well known. I mean, people love these guys. But this one, I think people need to jam this one a lot more, because this is just kind of a little gem that popped up in '97 and reminded us that death metal was still very much alive, but just in the underground. It didn't really buck to a lot of trends. It was slightly more groovy, but it was still 100% old school death metal. And I fucking love this one. Definitely jam it. Okay, I can technically bring up both albums on this. This is a compilation reissue of Golem. The one I specifically wanted to bring up was Second Moon. These guys worshipped the shit out of Carcass, but it was interesting because they worshipped most of the Heartwork era. Like most Carcass worship bands, like I bring up Exhumed. Exhumed loves Carcass, you can definitely tell, but they like the older stuff, like Symphonies of Sickness and Necroticism. These guys loved the Heartwork sound, and you can tell in the production, even the vocals, the guitar tone, it was 100% there. The Shortening of the Way on Second Moon is an absolutely fantastic track, and it really has that cool Carcass sound. Like, I don't know if these guys are still around at all, but this was a super underground release I heard about a few years ago. I picked this up and jammed the shit out of it. I love it. I think it's really great. Some interesting choices in the original cover art. This is definitely a lot better. There was you just have to look them up. It's interesting. At least that first album is Eternity: The Weeping Horizons. But this is just an awesome jam, especially if you love Carcass, like I do. Definitely check it out. Really good stuff. You know, maybe they were underrated because they sounded too much like Carcass, and it was really difficult to distinguish. But either way, good work. Hateplow, Everything Dies. This was, I guess you could call a supergroup. It had Rob Barrett from Cannibal Corpse, Phil Facina, whatever, the main guitarist and original member that's still in the band from Malevolent Creation, Cal Simmons, who was a one-time singer for Malevolent Creation, and it is very much straight up like old school death metal. It it really sounds like Malevolent Creation in a lot of spots, but there's hints of grind all throughout it, which kind of distinguish it a bit. And the fact that Kyle Simmons is also singing on it makes it sound like Malevolent Creation a little bit more. But this one was just a little bit more straightforward. The songs were shorter, definitely grindier. There's a bit of a hardcore influence on it, but this still stays very much in the vein of death metal, and it was a solid release. They're listed as active now, but I don't know if that's actually going on. Rob Barrett seems pretty busy in Cannibal Corpse. Malevolent Creation just put out a new album. I believe their original drummer passed on. So I don't know how active this one actually is, but I mean, if they get together again, cool, I'll check it out. Defleshed, Under the Blade. This is a, I believe, Swedish band, and these guys really mixed a lot of thrash elements into death metal. Like, this is still very much a straightforward death metal album, but it has that more crunchy thrash tone, and I don't know, it's just very riff-centric and a lot of fun. Like, I don't know, imagine like Children of Bodom without the keyboards and then more of a profound death metal influence throughout instead of arguably some power metal. It's a really good band. Like, they kind of came out in, I think this was their first album. It came out in '97. It was on Metal Blade Records, and it just kind of flew under the radar. They have, I believe, 2 or 3 other releases. I'd have to actually check. I only have a couple other ones. But very straightforward, very riff-centric, very fast. Like, these guys really don't slow down for a fucking minute. And, you know, it just kind of works with it. It's just all, like, just hyper angry, fucking thrashy death metal, and I dig the fuck out of it. Like, God, what was it? What's the one on here? Metal Bounded was a lot of fucking fun on here. Eat the Meat Raw. You know, I mean, there's a lot of self-aware, you know, like, hey, we're death metal, we're supposed to be over the top kind of shit on here, and I fucking love that. Definitely check this one out. Well, I brought them up before. Malevolent Creation, Eternal. This was the first album where they were off of Roadrunner Records after Stillborn, because that record was a disaster, and I think their contract was up and Roadrunner was getting ready to move in a different direction, I think. This came out on Pavement Records. This is the first one where Jason Blakowicz, the bassist, took over on vocals, and he did a pretty admirable job. This one actually brought in some slower songs. It wasn't all that token hyper, you know, blast beat, thrashy death metal that Malevolent Creation was known for. And it actually had some more atmospheric moments, like, what was the Enslaved? Enslaved is a particularly good example of that. It's more mid-tempo, but it has a lot of really cool tremolo strumming on it, and it's actually kind of melodic, and, you know, it builds some atmosphere, which is not something Malevolent Creation is known for. I really enjoy this album. It kind of flies under the radar for a lot of fans. You know, no Brent Hoffman on it. People loved him. You know, rest in peace there too. He was an awesome singer. But, you know, it just, you know, people don't really like jive to this one as much. I think it's a really good one. Definitely would qualify as underrated for their discography. They had a lot of good albums. I know, like, some of their standings on social things are a little dated and kind of fucked up. But musically, pretty solid band. Definitely check it out. Speaking of more well-known acts, Deicide, Serpents of the Light. This was, what, their 4th album? And while it is not as good as their original 3 albums, which are pretty much death metal royalty when it comes down to the whole Florida scene, this is still a solid album. This one kind of gets swept under the rug just a little bit. Like, this is where people started saying there was a decline in the quality. And while I think it wasn't as heavy, especially in terms of the production, it felt a little thin. The songs were still really good. I love the title track, particularly Slave to the Cross, another really good one on here. Excuse me. But yeah, all in all, I think it's a really good album. It just doesn't get as much recognition. I think it's more known for the really killer artwork on it. I fucking love this cover. You know, once again, Glenn Benton, loves the shit out of Christianity. Loves it. Yeah, I don't get there's a fair amount of hatred for this album. Not as much as the ones that came after this, which I'm in agreement. I own those albums and I got them just to round out the collection, and they're kind of bad. But this one, I think it's still good and definitely worth jamming. If you can find it, check it out. Cryptopsy, Whisper Supremacy. This one gets a pretty fair amount of hate, and I think I know one of the reasons. It was the change in singers. Lord Worm left the band or was kicked out. It's really foggy there. I think he just left the band, though. And they brought in Mike DeSalvo, who was part of more of a New York death metal cell. Like, he wasn't part of that whole technical brutal death thing as much. And I thought this one was really good. I thought his vocals were particularly good on this one, too. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Lord Worm's style. Like, yeah, he sounds like this frantic, rabid monster, and he can do a lot of stuff, and he sounds crazy as shit, but it just doesn't really resonate with me as much as this guy, or even their current singer, who I think is pretty fucking awesome live. Super nice guy, too. But yeah, this one gets a lot of hatred. I think it's a solid album. It's well recorded. They kind of took a dive after this, and then DeSalvo left. But this one just flies on the radar, and I don't think it deserves some of the hatred I've seen. I've looked at the reviews on this, and they were pretty harsh. And yeah, change is difficult, but the sound really didn't change at the core. You know, the only thing that really changed was the vocals, and they weren't bad. So definitely check this one out. You know, form your own opinion. This is all opinion based anyway, so yeah, check it out. It's a good release. And then finally, Deeds of Flesh, Inbreeding the Antropophagi. Yeah, no, that's the word. Yeah, sure. This was one of the few newer bands that were coming up, like, in that era. Like, I think they came around in '95, that actually started building a nice little underground bit of success. And this also brought us Unique Leader Records, because Lindmark, who recently passed on too, became the head of that. That was his own imprint, and he started signing bands too. And of course, he signed his own band, Deeds of Flesh, which were really solid, brutal death metal. Like, you know, just heavy as balls. Definitely influential to slam bands too, which I'm not necessarily a fan of them, but I really dig this guy's fucking work. I mean, the whole band. Really good three-piece, just straightforward, very much in the vein of like Dying Fetus. They just kind of flew on the radar for a while. I think this was their third or fourth release. This came out in '98. And just a really good brutal death metal band. Like, flat out. Like, they really only had, like, they have a couple albums I'm not into as much, but they were pretty much, they stayed a nice, like, baseline of quality and consistency throughout their career. Straightforward as fuck. You know, it 98, and I mean, by then the whole nu metal bug was happening. Korn was fucking blowing up, so naturally this is gonna fucking fall on the radar. Thrash was pretty much non-existent, so it was just pretty much the timing of things. You know, this was an unfriendly era for death metal, but we got a resurgence later, which I'll be doing a video about underrated albums from the early 2000s. So definitely check this one out. Check all these out, because there was a lot of stuff that kind of just fell under the radar. There's a lot of stuff I'm probably missing too, and if you have any suggestions of stuff I should listen from the late 90s in terms of death metal, I'm more than welcome to jam it. There are some I omitted on here because I thought they were more established bands. You know, could have left in, you know, Obituary, Hate Eternal popped up in '99. I thought I would bring on them, but they're a pretty well-established band, and I don't think a lot of their releases are underrated. But, you know, there's still tons of these to do. You know, the 2000s had a lot of cool ones. I might have to do multiple parts for those, but I want to do it by 5-year increments. But anyway, if you like this little section of underrated albums, give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe. We do talks like this all the time. And I will catch you later.